Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Lambda School Mini Bootcamp. We are going to be going over Lesson 6 today, which is going to be our continuation of JavaScript, and we're going to start talking about arrays tonight. Before we get started with that, if you are new to the bootcamp, welcome. We are about at our halfway point tonight, so if you do need to get caught up, there are links in the GitHub repository, and all of our videos are available on YouTube. It's just starting at Lesson 1. If you are new to the class, I'd like to kind of go over a little bit about what Lambda School is and what we're doing here, and then also what we offer as our full-time immersive program. So this is a 12-lesson mini boot camp, fundamentals of web development. So we're going over from the very beginning, the introduction to Git and GitHub. We talk about HTML and CSS, go into some more CSS. We do a bunch of JavaScript lessons. We're on our third JavaScript lesson tonight, and we have 3 more after tonight. And then we kind of wrap it all up together and build a little mini web app. And this is kind of just to give you a taste of what it's like to use the tools that a real professional web developer uses, and kind of give you a taste of what it's like to go through our full program at Lambda School. A little bit about that program is it is a 6-month web development and computer science immersive. So we go over really all tenets of web development. We talk about HTML, CSS, UI development. We go into React and other front-end frameworks. We talk about backend as well. So we go into Node and different databases, and then we build a personal project, and then we go into our computer science portion. We have a full computer science portion of this course as well. So it is 6 months long for the full-time program, and the part-time program, which we offer twice a year. The next one, I believe, starting in July. Is 12 months long, and it's in the evenings for those of you that are working professionals or have other obligations like family life. We're really proud at Lambda School to be able to offer de-risked education. So what that means is that we take on the risk with you. We offer our full-time program at $0 down, so it's absolutely free to go through until you graduate. Just a reminder, this mini bootcamp is free, but our full-time program is free until you graduate. We are able to do that because of the use of what we call income share agreements. So it's our job to get you fully prepared to join the professional world, and fully prepared to be hired as a full-time software developer. Once you've gotten a job as a software developer, and you make more than $50,000 a year, then we get repaid. And so we do 17% of your annual salary for 2 years, up to $30,000. So you have to be making over $50,000 as a software developer, and otherwise it's all free. And so it's our job to get you to that point. And so we definitely share the risk with you, and try to make this as risk-averse or risk-free as possible to you. You know, you are risking your time and energy to be here, and we are giving you some high-quality computer science education and preparing you for a job as a developer in the real world. We do have classes that start the first Monday of every month. Our next class starts on March 5th. Our admissions staff has told me to inform everyone that we've only got a few spots left in March. So if you haven't applied and you're thinking about applying, please do so as soon as possible. And please mention the fact that you're going through the mini boot camp. We definitely look highly on those that have put in the time and the effort to go through this mini boot camp and to work on this material on your own. That really speaks highly of you. And it really shows well to our admissions staff. So if you are planning on applying and you haven't done so yet, please apply as soon as possible, and we can expedite your application if you want to start on that March 5th date. Or we also accept applications, I believe, up to 6 months in advance. So But that's our full-time course, and we are here at our mini boot camp. And we'd like to, share this for free with you and kind of show you what web developers do. And so today we're going to continue our our lessons on JavaScript, and we are going to talk about arrays. So let me share my screen with you. And so yesterday we went into a little bit more intermediate JavaScript, and we were talking about, we went over loops. One second. We talked about some kind of data types that don't really fit in any structure with undefined and null. We talked about comparison operators, which are greater than, less than, greater than, equal to, equality operators, not. And we talked about control flow a little bit more with our if, else if, and else statements. We talked about logical operators, which are the and. Remember the and statement. Oops, always do that. And the or statement, the not, which is actually going to reverse your Boolean statement. We talked about for loops a little bit, kind of introduced you to the basic syntax of a for loop. We have let I equals 0, I less than 10, essentially something like that is our basic syntax of a for loop. And I touched on the arguments object a little bit. There was a little bit of a mix-up, and there was an arguments question on the lesson 5 homework last night. That assignment was supposed to be done tonight. So we're going to go through that and kind of the basis for that tonight with when we talk about arrays, and I'll go back over the arguments, and then you can go back and do that question from lesson 5 tonight once you get this lesson in. But tonight we are going to talk about arrays. Let's pull that guy up. We're going to have an introduction to arrays, and then we're going to talk about for loops with arrays. Arrays are a really important part and an important data structure in JavaScript, and we use them all over the place. And so this lesson is going to be completely devoted to arrays and how to use them. There are different properties to them, how to access items in arrays, etc. And then we'll talk about using a for loop, and as I kind of hinted at last night, using that for loop and that variable I to begin as kind of a convention for looping over arrays. But you don't know what an array is yet, so let's talk about those. We've discussed 3 basic data types in the last few lessons. We talked about strings, numbers, and booleans, and we call those primitive data types. So those are just, if you remember, just a string. A number is any number, and a boolean is either true or false, right? So we talked about how to use variables to assign variables to hold that data. So if you remember, we had first name, and we had my name on there. So the thing is about variables is that they're only able to hold one data type, one piece of data. So if I wanted to have this not be first name, but something like full name, I couldn't do this. There's 2 different strings here. My first name Dan and my last name Frainer. I've comma separated, but it's just you can't have a single variable hold on to multiple pieces of data, just there as they are. So if I wanted to do something like this, I could use a data structure, which is a little bit more advanced than just our basic primitive data types. And I can use it, and there's one, our first one we're going to learn is called an array. And so an array is just, we instantiate array by just giving it these 2 brackets. Okay, these square brackets are how we instantiate an array. So inside of this array, I can put as many pieces of data as I want. And this variable will only ever be pointing to one data type, which is the array. And the array we think of as a container, okay, and a container for data. And so it allows us to put a bunch of data in this container and move that whole container around as we please. We'll learn later how to manipulate data in that container, how to access it, how to add data to that container. But for right now, we're just going to instantiate a new array. And we're going to call this students' names. So this is a great example. If we had our classroom here and we wanted to keep a hold of every student that's in the class, we can instantiate an array, and I'm going to call myself a student today. We can say Dan, we can say Maria, we can say Jeff, we can say Raj, and say we have 4 students in our class. And now we have the access to 4 separate strings within our one data type within one variable here. And that's simply how you build an array, how you build a simple array. That's our simple array instantiation, is we just wrap all of those data types, which are, as you can see, comma separated. We wrap them in these brackets, okay? And then we still put our semicolon at the end because that's the end of what our what we're doing here. We're setting this variable to this array, okay? So that's how we set up an array. Thing to note for those of you that are coming from other computer languages, arrays are not, like all variables, are not in JavaScript typed. So you can have a mixed types of data in this single array. We can give it numbers, we can give it Booleans, we can give it other arrays, and it doesn't matter. For convention's sake, most of the time, you are going to always see the same data type in an array. But just know that it's possible to have other data types in arrays. Also, for those of you from other languages, arrays don't have to be set to a certain size when we instantiate them. So when we first build them, they don't have to be set to a certain size. They can be totally empty, and we can then go in and add 100,000 pieces of data if we'd like. 2 things to keep in mind. If you're not coming from another language, don't worry about what I just said. Let's just talk about arrays. So one thing to note, that just like a string has, let's say my first name, once again, just like a string has a .length property on it, we can run that and we'll see it's 3. So if you remember from our JavaScript 1 lesson or introduction to JavaScript, string.length counts each character in the string. We'll see we get back 3. Just like string has that, arrays also have a .length property to it. So we can write students names .length. What the .length property on an array is going to do is it's going to count the items in the array. So it's not going to count every character in every string in the array like we would think string does. It's actually going to count each item in the array. So this is one item. It's comma separated to the second item, comma separated to the third item, to the fourth item. So there will be 4 items in this array. And we see here that 4 comes up, okay? So it works just like the .length in string, except it counts the items as a whole. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. We do use .length quite frequently when messing around with arrays, and we'll actually get back into that in just a moment, in accessing items and using them in loops and things like that. It's a really powerful part of the array, is that fact that we have access to the amount of items inside of that array. So let's talk about accessing items in an array now. Now that we have these 4 items in here, we can type student with console log student names, and we'll see that that array with all those 4 students' names are in it. So what happens if we want to just grab one of those students' names and console log that? Well, we have that access and that ability because arrays, when items are in an array, each item is assigned their own numerical index. And we can use that index to retrieve the item specifically. We can use that index to change what is at that index, change the item in there. And we can do a lot of things with it. One thing to note about arrays, and this is probably one of the most confusing things about arrays, is that the items in an array, their index starts at 0. Okay, so I'm just going to throw a comment on there, and I'm going to say the first item in the array is always going to be 0. Okay, the second will be 1. 2. So even though there are 4 items in this array, the last item in the array has an index of 3. Okay, that is just something that I'm going to repeat over and over again about arrays. It's because that is one of the more difficult concepts to remember and to wrap your head around and understand, like, why isn't such and such program that I'm writing working? And it might be because you are looking to get the first item in the array and using the number 1. So it's really important to note that it always starts at 0 and it goes sequentially. Arrays, an amazing thing about arrays compared to other data structures is they hold the order that the items were in there. So when we start talking about objects tomorrow, there is no guarantee of order in any other data type or data structure in JavaScript. With arrays, there is, though. So we have the order of the items, and they'll always be referenced in that exact order. So the first order of business is accessing items in an array. So if I wanted to access Maria, if I just wanted to console log that name, I can write the student names, and then what I do is I give it 2 little brackets. So let me just, instead of console logging, I'm just going to write this out in the open here. So you write the name of the variable that's pointing to that array, which is students' names, which is this array. I write 2 brackets, and then inside of those brackets, I write the index of the name I want. So in this case, it's Maria, and I want to print her name to the screen. And I'll console log that. And we'll see now that Maria gets printed to the screen. We can do this with all. We want Raj to be printed to the screen. There we go. I want my name to be printed to the screen. Remember, it's 0. So we can access any item in the array using this bracket and index notation. Okay, so anytime you want to access an item, use the brackets. So we know that the first item in our array is always going to be 0, right? And so we can always tell what the first item is by just giving it the index of 0, and we'll get the first item, no matter what it is. It might not be Dan anymore. It might be Steve. Well, Steve is now the first item, right? So it's at the 0 index, and now we're always going to get the first item in the array by using 0. What happens if we want to access the last item in the array? I know that in some languages, if you've studied other languages, you can just put -1 and it'll loop back around. JavaScript doesn't work that way. If you put -1, it'll give us undefined. So in order to access the last item in the array, we know that, let's add a new numerical index for Raj. We know that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items in this array. We know that the indexes are always offset by 1. So the first item is 0, the second item is 1, third item is 2, fourth 3, fifth 4, so on. And we know that we have access to a special property of arrays, which is the length property. So let's just type in students' names dot length, and we're going to comment that out. And we see that that length property is 5, and no matter how many names we add to it, it's going to update it to how many items are in the array. So if we have Sarah in here now, and that name has a numerical index of 5, we know that the length is 6. So how do we access the last item in the array? Well, we can use this inside of our brackets. If we were to do students' names, let's just type this out, and then students' names dot length in the brackets, it's going to give us a 6. And what's at our 6th numerical index? Well, nothing's at our 6th numerical index. We only have 6 items in there, right? So what we do is we do length, and then we say -1. And now that's going to give us our last item in the array. No matter who the last item is, it's always going to give us the last item in the array. Okay, because it's going to look at the length of the array, so the amount of items in it. In this case, it's 3, and it's going to say -1, so that's going to be 2. So then it's going to look for the numerical index of 2, and that'll be Maria. And so that's how we access the last item in the array. So using this exact same syntax, this bracket syntax, we can read or access items in an array, and we can also assign the item in the array to something else. So remember when we had talked about on our first JavaScript lesson, the assignment operator is the single equal sign, right? So you can see it right here. Const is our keyword for a constant variable in JavaScript. Students' names is the name of that variable, and the equal sign is assigning that variable name to this data. Okay, so a single equal sign is always an assignment. And using that idea, we can now assign whatever is at the index of 0. We can say, whatever is here, we're going to tell you something new. So I spelled Stephen's name wrong when he was entered into the syllabus or the class list here. So let's do this. Console.log students names. Before we do it, and let's console.log students names after we assign. And I'm going to remove a few of these just so we're not super cluttered. Now we can see that before we did that assignment, we had the array with 3 strings in it. The first one was Steve, Dan, and Maria. After we assigned that numerical index to something new, we now have Stephen, Dan, and Maria. Okay, so we can, what we're essentially doing is we are telling the array, whatever is in that 0 spot, that first spot, this is what it should equal now. So we use the assignment to create something new to equal that. And we can do the same thing for length for the last item or for any item in there. Now we can have Steve, Dan, and Stephen instead of Maria in there, etc. And so we can use any of those, any of the numerical indexes to reassign whatever's in there. We can also use an index that's not in there yet. So if we see we have 0, 1, 2, because there's 3 items, we can assign the index at 3 to something else. And now we see that we have Steve, Dan, Maria, and Steve, Dan, Maria, and Stephen in there, even though there was no 3rd index in the original one. That's kind of a funky way of adding items to an array. Thankfully, we have some really great methods that we can use to add items to an array that have one specific job, and that's to add and remove items from an array. So let's change Stephen. Let's go back to Raj. To use these, there are 4 methods. They're called push, pop, shift, and unshift. And they all have a specific purpose. And they all kind of do something really similar, but they do it in a different way. The first we're going to talk about is push. And what push does is it's going to take an item and add it to the end of the array. Okay? It's going to add it to an end of the array. And so we see, if we run that again, let's add some context to these console logs. Our before is we have an array with Steve, Dan, and Maria in the array. And our after, we have, after we've used push, we have Steve, Dan, Maria, and Raj in there. So push is always going to add the item to the end of the array. Now we see we've pushed 2 items. So the first item is that Raj is going to get pushed onto the array. And then after, Sarah is going to get pushed onto the end of the array. And remember, it keeps the order that the items were added in. So now we have the ability to add items to the end of the array. Okay. What do we do when we want to remove an item from the end of the array? We don't want it anymore. Like, let's say Raj dropped out and he doesn't want to be in the class anymore. We need to remove him from our class list. We have an amazing method for that, and it's called pop. Okay. And pop is going to have parentheses, but you're not going to put anything in there. So I apologize, I didn't talk about the syntax of push and pop yet. We're going to have the name of the array. We're going to have a dot, just a simple period, and then the name of the method. And we'll talk about methods a little more in depth when we talk about objects and creating them. But just know for now, this is the syntax. And then after the method name, we are going to have these parentheses. In the case of push, we needed to include something in there to add into it, all right? So we needed to put some data in there to add on to the end of the array. In the case of pop, we're not adding anything to the array. We're just taking the last item off the end of the array. Okay, so you don't need to put anything in there. You can put whatever you want in here, and it's not going to matter because it doesn't read that. So now we can see before we popped, we had 4 students, with Raj being the last student in the class. And after we popped, Raj is no longer in the array. One thing to note, I get a question about this a lot, is that you can't pop specific items from an array. There are more advanced methods you can use, but for the time being right now, pop is always going to take the last item off the end of the array. So even if you said, like, I want to pop the second index or whatever, it always is going to take the last item off the end of the array, no matter what. So just keep that in mind. Right now in our learning, there is no way to remove just Dan from that array. And it is a limitation of arrays. And we'll talk about the differences as we go. And we get much deeper into this in the full course when we start talking about data structures and how to build them and their pluses and minuses. And that's a subject that we go pretty in depth in our full course. But for right now, we don't have a way of removing single items from the middle of an array. We can remove it from the end using pop. All right, so now that we've learned what push and pop are, we can learn what shift and unshift are. Okay, so shift is now going to be the version of pop that works on the front of the array. So these are a little more, I don't want to say confusing, but a little less intuitive, I would say, than push and pop. You know, push, you're pushing something on, pop, you're popping something off. Shift, you know, even strong developers that have been using these for a while still tend to get shift and unshift a little confused here and there. So that's why it's always good practice to, you know, look up in the docs, find out what you're doing, do a little test case of what shift does versus unshift. But what shift is going to do in kind of lower level terms is it's going to shift every single item over one and remove that first item. So it's going to remove the first item, essentially, and now we can see every other item moved over one in their index. Kind of. So I'm going to hit shift, and this is what it's going to do. Okay, so it shifts over one space, and it removes that first item. And we can see when we do that before and after, we have Steve, Dan, Maria, and Raj. And then we also, after we have shifted, we've removed Steve, so now we just have Dan, Maria, and Raj. Okay, so shift removes the first item off the array. Shift's brother is unshift. And unshift is going to do what push does, and it's going to add an item to the front of the array. So it's going to, let's say, what we got missing, Sarah's missing. So what it's going to do essentially is it's going to do this. All right, we're going to go unshift, and it's going to say, there we go. So now Sarah is going to be at that 0 index, and it's going to push all the items ahead one. And so now we're going to add that item to the front of the array. And we can see that now, where before we had Steve, Dan, Maria, Raj, and after we've unshifted, we have Sarah, Steve, Dan, Maria, and Raj. So Sarah got added to the front. And we can, you know, mix and match these as we want. So if we want to add an item to the front of the array and then remove the last item, we can absolutely do that. Oops. Student students names. Now we see that in our after, Sarah has been added to the front and Raj has been removed off the end. And so we can start using these to add and remove items exactly where we want. Well, from the front or the back specifically. Yeah, so that's, remember, unshift adds an item to the front, shift removes an item to the front. Push adds an item to the end. Pop removes an item to the end. I see this question right now, and I just want to answer it. If shift and unshift are opposite, why not push and unpush? Very valid point. The JavaScript, the committee that writes JavaScript has written these over time. And so the committee that wrote the specs for push and pop, I believe push and pop came first, or maybe years after shift and unshift. Since JavaScript is a language that needs to be backwards compatible all the way back to essentially the beginning of the JavaScript language, just because there does exist web browsers in the wild that are 20 plus years old, it needs to stay backwards compatible. So, the folks that wrote shift and unshift might have thought that was a way better thing to call it, and they might have thought push and pop was a foolish thing to call it. And so they added their specs, but we can't go back and change push and pop, essentially. So there is a little bit of committee politics involved in writing these specifications for JavaScript. And it is a unique language in that it does have to be backwards compatible, essentially forever. And so we get a little bit of discrepancies here and there, and you'll notice them as we go through. And that's why I like to bring up the point of always, learn to read documentation. That's definitely something we go over in our full course is really reading documentation. Mozilla Developer Network is kind of the de facto documentation for JavaScript now. So MDN is what everyone calls it. And let's go to technologies, JavaScript. And now you can come in here and let's go to built-in objects, statements, functions, classes. I believe it's classes. Nope. Let's look up an array. Array. Oop. And now we have all of our methods on this left here, and we can look up pop, and it'll tell us exactly what it does. And we can look up shift, and it tells us exactly what it does. And it might not make sense, especially at first, because this is written in a very technical way. But getting used to finding this information and reading the documentation is an invaluable tool you'll have as a developer. You can always Google and Stack Overflow, but actually getting deep into the documentation yourself and kind of figuring it out and learning how to read it is a really invaluable tool you can have as a developer. So let's move on. We're going to now talk about our for loops in the context of an array. And so when we had written our loop before, let's write just that basic for loop. So then we'll just say 10 again, I plus plus. Remember, plus plus is just adding 1 to I. And then we can console log I. And now we see it starts at 0 because we set that I to 0. And it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And when it gets to 10, 10 is no longer less than 10, so it stops. Remember, we have our 3 items in that for loop. Okay, we have our variable instantiation, so we create a new variable and set it to something. We have a conditional expression, which is going to be read every single time it loops. And we have the what it's going to do every time it loops. What happens is the first run through, it sets that variable. It then checks that for truthiness. And so if this returns true, then it runs what's in these brackets. So we're going to see console log I, which is 0. So there's our first one up there. Then it's going to add or do whatever we asked it to do right here, and then check that again. So in this case, I is now going to be 1. It's going to say, is 1 less than 10? Yes, that's true. Run what's in there. So now I is 1, and so console log I is going to be 1. And it goes through that each and every time, and we see it's looped through this 10 times from 0 to 9. And we have that printed out 0 to 9. Once 9 is printed out, it then says I plus plus, and now I is equal to 10. And then it checks this and says, is 10 less than 10? False. So now it's going to stop the loop and exit. And so in this case, we can start to see possibly how we would use this to read items in an array or affect items in an array in general. So we see we have 0, 1, 2, 3. We know that arrays start at 0. They go in order, 1, 2, 3. So now we can see that we can start to use an array or a for loop to read items in an array. And if I is a variable that equals a number, we can then use it just like we would in our brackets here. And so I is going to change each time this is run, each time these brackets are run. And now we can access each item, right? It's going to start at 0. So then it's going to say student's name's 0, and that's going to be Steve. It's going to run through, and then I is going to be 1. Student's name of 1, that's going to be Dan, Maria, Raj, etc. And so we can say, if I is less than 4, let's console log the student's name. Now we see we got each student's name printed out here. Well, what happens if we add Sarah back to a class? We're going to run through it 4 times, and it's going to print out the first 4 names in the array. And when it gets to number 4, which is where Sarah's at, index 4, it's going to say 4 is less than 4. So that's going to be false, and her name is not going to get printed to the screen. Now, we can go in and do this, and it'll work, but then what if we add another student? And what if we don't know the length or how many students are in the array? I kind of give that away. What if we don't know how many students are in the array? What if we just given students names and that comes from another part of the program? We need to be able to run through every student's name, no matter how many students are in there or not. And if we remember back to the beginning of the lesson, we had talked about all arrays have a length property. And so instead of hard coding the number in, we can just say students' names dot length. And now, no matter how many students are in the array, we're always going to get every single student out of the array. And some of you may be confused as to why we say I is less than student's name dot length. So let's go talk about that. So remember before when we had Sarah on here, Sarah was the index of 4. So let's put 4 in there, right? But she doesn't show up because we are stopping once this is false. And once we get to 3, it's going to read off Raj's name, and then it's going to add 1. It's going to say 4 is less than 4, and that's false. So we always have to have 1 more than the index. So we know that the dot length property on arrays is always going to return a number that's 1 more than the index, because there's 5 students in this array, but since we start at 0, we have 1 less than the index as our last item. So now we're always going to get all of the students out of the array. And that's using a for loop to access the items in the array. And now once we have access to all those items, we can do all kinds of things. We can do some more advanced stuff that I'm not going to go too deep into right now. But what if we wanted to reassign every student in the array to something else? We can do that using our assignment. And so you can start to see where all these pieces are kind of coming together. And we're creating these little mini programs. So loops are pivotal in talking about arrays and in using arrays because they're probably more likely than not, you're not going to know how many items are in the array. And more likely than not, you're probably not going to care how many items are in the array, but you want to do something to each item in that array. And so that's where loops come in. So I said that we would talk about the arguments object a little bit more, and we're going to do that now. So let me write a function as numbers. So I'm going to get rid of that. So arguments, as I talked about last night, is an object that's available in every single function. And remember, we can console log it, and then go adds numbers. And even though there's no arguments within our parentheses here, we're still adding arguments to it. So it's still able to take it, right? And we can see that our arguments object there's our first argument, there's our second argument, there's our third argument. And now we can kind of see that this is starting to resemble an array a little bit, right? So the first argument has an index of 0. Second argument has an index of 1. Third has an index of 2. And so we call arguments an array-like object. It has a .length property to it. We have 3 there. And it's also able to access items using array-like syntax. So 1 is going to be the second item, so that should be 2. And we see that there. 2 is the third item, so that should be 3. So it has the length property, and you are able to access items, even if they're not given names, essentially, in here. And it keeps the order, just like an array does. It's not a full array because it doesn't have push, pop, shift, unshift, etc. But we can use a loop less than arguments length to loop over all of the arguments in the arguments object or array-like object. Console log arguments I, just like we did with that loop just now for our array. So we can think of arguments as an array that just doesn't have any other methods other than length and the ability to access items by their index. Now we see we have 1, 2, 3, and we can give these, we can be strings if we wanted to. A, B, C. Now we see that it reads out all of the arguments for us. So that's going to be the pivotal part of that first question, multiply arguments from lesson 5 last night. So now we have the knowledge of what an array is, how arrays work, how to access items in an array, the length property on an array, some awesome methods of arrays, push, pop, shift, unshift, and how to write a for loop to access all the items in the array. Using this, you can now go back and start to work on that multiply arguments, knowing that arguments is kind of like an array. And it has the length and has that accessibility where we can use the index to access items in the array. That's where we're going to stop tonight. And all of your assignment for lesson 6 is going to be on arrays. So I'm going to turn it over to the questions channel and talk about all of the questions we have. I'll start to the beginning. All right, let's see. Okay, got that one. Just JavaScript awesomeness. You know, that's the thing about JavaScript. It is awesome, especially with ES6 and ES7 and 8. 2018 is what they're calling the newest one, and it's getting really, really great and really powerful. But it still has access to all of the older features to it. What that does for us is that doesn't create a rift in communities where we only use this version of JavaScript, or we only use that version of JavaScript. We all use the same version in just different ways. Slice is a more advanced array method that you will learn about. Either we won't talk about it in this class necessarily, but slice does not remove items. Slice makes miniature arrays out of bigger arrays. Is what it does. It does not remove items from an array though. But that's a more advanced array method. Do you find for in to be a better loop structure for arrays? No. So don't use for in on arrays. What for in is for is objects, and arrays have methods on them that aren't part of their array. So the dot length and all of the methods that we have could be included in a for in loop, whereas just a regular for loop, we are specifying that we are talking about the index. So for in loops are kind of only for objects. Don't use a for in loop for arrays. Particular reason for let versus var. So let is an ES6 keyword. It's kind of the new var. The specifics of it are let has block level scope and var doesn't. That's really advanced, but those are pretty much that's the only difference between let and var. It's up to you. There are applications where using var could be useful, or using let could be more useful. I use let in const, essentially. When would you use return in a function? So we return a function. We went over this on last Thursday. When we want to return something from a function, when we want the function to give us feedback, to give us something else. Just a reminder, console log is only for developers. Only us as developers with a specific console open can see what console log does. And it doesn't do anything. It just prints on the screen, on the console screen, what we want. If we want adds numbers to do something and then to give us a number back or give us something back, we need to return it. And so we always should return something from the function. I see what's the best definition of arguments. I'm going to take that as arguments in general, not just the arguments object. So arguments are data that we can supply to a function. We can give them names. So if we say first, second, third, we can give them names. And then when we supply that data to the function, it links up those names with that data. So we can then just call that first item by that first variable name, second item by the second variable name, etc. And that's what arguments are. Do I use a transpiler to convert ES6 to ES5? It depends on the team you're on and the company you're working for. All evergreen browsers, which is what we call them, all new browsers. So Google Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari are all evergreen browsers, and that they automatically update, and they all support ES6 out of the box. But there are a lot of browsers out there that do not support ES6, and so we use libraries like Babel, Webpack to convert ES6 to ES5. And that's something we go into in the full-time course, and that's something that we shouldn't really be concerned with right now, because the industry is moving to full ES6 compliance. So we are all using ES6 now. And if we need to support an older browser, we do use something like Babel. All right, everybody. Well, that's our lesson for tonight. Thanks for hanging out in lesson 6 and learning about arrays. I hope you have a great time working on the assignment tonight, and we're going to come back tomorrow at 5 p.m. Pacific and start talking about objects, which are another data structure that have their own unique features and methods to it. But thanks a lot for joining us tonight, and we'll see you tomorrow.